Symphony of the Night granted the Castlevania franchise a hefty amount of credibility, but it also delayed the inevitable. In 1997, the third dimension took hold of the industry with releases like Mario Kart, Star Fox, GoldenEye, Quake 2, Gran Turismo, and Final Fantasy VII. It was this year Konami put its Kobe team on the next Castlevania game, nicknamed Dracula 3D. It would launch on the Nintendo 64, and it was the first game in 13 years to be simply called Castlevania. Castlevania 64 was released on January 26, 1999 in America. This time, Japan had to wait 3 months. It was subtitled Apocalypse overseas. The development team originally planned to include 4 characters, but deadlines later forced them to remove 2. One of these canceled Crusaders, named Collar, had his elements appropriately reused for a Frankenstein-esque boss called the Gardener. The remaining heroes were Reinhard Schneider, a Belmont heir, and Carrie Fernandez, a magically gifted orphan. Both characters were picked at the outset and could not be swapped along the journey. Each had to march through 10 areas to reach the finale. 7 were shared and 3 were exclusive to each character, making 13 levels total. The librarian from Symphony became Renan, an enterprising vendor who also happened to be a demon. If you spent over 30,000 gold, he would lay claim to your soul and challenge you in battle just before the final string of boss encounters. Reinhardt fought with a whip and dagger, and Carrie could charge her spells with throw metal rings. Only 4 sub-weapons made the cut, now powered by red jewels instead of red hearts. The gameplay also added options for camera control, normal, battle, and action. The perspective could be snapped into place with the R button, and certain bosses locked the camera intentionally. Today it's hard for most fans to take the visuals in Castlevania 64 seriously, but initially, the game received mostly favorable reviews. Criticisms were focused on the spastic camera, slow character movement, and inconsistent controls. But considering it was Konami Kobe's first 3D project, it was to be expected. They did pull Dracula's domicile off a flat surface, bringing the oppressive atmosphere to life. The elements that were either cut or rushed to make the release date were saved for a sequel. Using these assets as a launchpad, they were able to turn around the next installment the same year. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness was released on November 30th in America and on Christmas Day in Japan. The Japanese title is the longest in the series, Demon Castle Dracula Apocalypse Gaiden Legend of Cornell. The protagonist, a wolfman nicknamed Blue Crescent Moon, was the other fallen playable character from the first N64 game. The press of a button brought on his transformation, increasing speed and damage but irreversibly draining the entire jewel count. Although Legacy started with Cornell's tale, a mission to recover his sister Ada from the clutches of Guess Who, the game is officially referred to as a special edition of, and prequel to, the original, and included many of the same zones, along with the option to unlock and play as Reinhardt and Carrie in new costumes and against new bosses. Finishing Cornell's quest started another, led by Holy Knight Henry Oldry. The honorable warrior had to rescue 6 children during his campaign, with each youngster unlocking more bonus content. He shared many of Cornell's powers, but carried a sidearm that could take care of business from long range. The added journeys explored new areas and revisited old haunts, altering an old level's appearance or having you cross it from another direction. Cornell's curse took a cue from Simon's quest, with certain events only happening when the sun or moon was above. Hearing complaints from fans, the camera and combat controls were streamlined. The improved visuals leaned on the Nintendo 64's expansion pack, but many reported the optional mode's performance to be inconsistent. two Nintendo 64 Castlevania games are not what you would call cherished by the series community, and most of this can be blamed on soaring expectations, along with some punishing platforming. Symphony of the Night in 3D sounded spectacular, but director Yuji Shibata's team had to settle on something between Tomb Raider and Nightmare Creatures. Their interpretation was authentic, with a look and feel that projected Castlevania's undertones, but the experience had to move faster if it was to keep up with the pace of Rondo or Symphony, not to mention the rapidly expanding 3D market. Eager to join any new console's library, Konami slated Castlevania to beguile the Sega Dreamcast even before Legacy of Darkness was finished. Castlevania Resurrection was first delayed in June of 1999, again in September of 2000, and put on indefinite hold in March of 2001, the same month the series first appeared on the Game Boy Advance. Production never restarted despite the game being seen at E3 via full motion video and a batch of promising screenshots. Development problems were later attributed to disagreements between the Japanese and American teams, along with the looming demise of the Dreamcast. It was the farthest a Castlevania game had traveled through development before getting canned. Fans amused themselves by calling it Cancelvania. With 3D plans on hold, the series stayed relevant on the GBA, using Symphony's model to satiate their fans on the go. Koji Igarashi had kept himself busy refining his console experiment on handhelds and creating new memorable characters. With the Dreamcast dead and the PS2 looming over its grave, Koji got his crew back together, including composer Michiru Yamane and illustrator Ayami Kojima, and set out to bring back that old familiar feeling. With 4 years having passed since faithful slayers could destroy evil with an analog stick, Konami wasn't interested in just another sequel. The next installment would have to be memorable. Castlevania Lament of Innocence was released exclusively for the PlayStation 2 on October 21, 2003 in North America and November 27 in Japan. Seeing as the story was set in 1094, Igarashi made it clear that this was the beginning of the Belmont saga. The greatest of Simon's grandfathers was named Leon Belmont, and like his descendants, he took on the undead forces to recover a lost love named Sarah. His friend Matthias Kronkfist warned him of the vampire Walter Bernard's sinister kidnapping, forcing Leon to seek the aid of Ronaldo Gandolfi, an alchemist living dangerously close to the castle's borders. Most vendors in Castlevania traded wares somewhere within the grounds, but Ronaldo offered his services before Leon's trial even began. He reluctantly told the Belmont about his newfound mythical whip called the Vampire Killer, that could reach the full potential its name suggested with a powerful act of sacrifice. Other elemental whips dropped off their corresponding bosses in optional fights, placing the skull-cracking weapon at the forefront once again. This was supplemented by sub-weapons, combos, and magical abilities. Sub-weapons could be crossed with one of 7 colored orbs to vary their effects, multiplying the different ways you could use them. For the first time, a Belmont could block and perform a duo of evasive maneuvers. Defeating Bernard, followed by death and finishing the game, unlocked 2 additional characters, Joachim Armster, one of the earlier bosses, and Pumpkin, a precocious trick-or-treater. Crazy Mode was also available after completion for the sadists, along with All Skills Mode for those who wanted to try out all of Leon's moves. Rather than looping around in circles or being tracked along an endless hallway, the 6 central divisions of the game could be reached from a central hub, letting players chart their progress. Unlike the 64 entries, which set hunters astray with no map to follow, Lament's gridlock of corridors and crevices was charted in a top-down screen that could be marked in various colors. The only thing missing was camera control. The right analog stick opened an equipment window instead, which served as the only method for wearing or using items. Lament of Innocence reminded Konami and its followers that Castlevania was all about action, even if it did flagrantly borrow elements from brawling shooters like Devil May Cry. There were a few touchy whip vaulting sections, but most rooms were cleared when every spawning monster turned to dust. While producing his first DS game for the franchise, Iga also supervised a sequel and kept the same clan of creative minds working to improve the formula. They jumped from the beginning of the timeline to 3 years after the third NES game, Dracula's Curse. A Belmont would once again become an adversary, and the new Slayer would have to make a deal with some devils. Castlevania Curse of Darkness arrived on the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox on November 5, 2005. Japan got the curse later the same month. Blazing a trail for Alucard to follow, the hero without a last name, Hector, left the employ of the perpetual Prince of Darkness days before Trevor Belmont did his duty. Although trying to pursue a normal life, Hector's fiancée was accused of being a witch and burned at the stake. Hector's old colleague Isaac claimed it was Hector that led to Dracula's fall and tried to rewrite all wrongs by calling Hector back home. Hector and Isaac were Devil Forge masters, or summoners of facilitating familiars. Hector could adopt and breed 6 different types of innocent devils, aka IDs: Fairy, Battle, Bird, Mage, Devil, and of course, Pumpkin. They could level up along with Hector and evolve into more useful forms depending on the weapon Hector used and grinding their experience. Julia introduced herself before too long as the game's vendor, supplying one-time weapons and ingredients for the forging trade. Since Hector was also not a Belmont, he could take his pick among a selection of blade types. Switching among the 5 brands of implements changed Hector's combos and fighting animations. This arsenal, along with stealing items from enemies, chaining attacks, and deflecting with a perfect guard, brought life to the continual trek through the game's zones. Finally banishing Dracula's Curse unlocked modes in a playable Trevor Belmont. Crazy players could endure Crazy Mode again, and a boss rush option became available at each warp room. Curse of Darkness took in scores equivalent to every 3D Castlevania game before it. The map layouts hadn't changed drastically since Lament, but the combat had a feel all its own, with evolving pets that kept the player company in the imposing claustrophobic areas. In 2005, a 2-volume manga adaptation of the same name premiered in Japan and was translated into English, starting in 2008. Like Dracula rising from the grave when a prophecy is fulfilled, Konami kept taking a crack at 3D with 2 teams, each producing 2 games that had to represent more than a decade of side-scrolling from any and all angles. Their success varies depending on who you ask. Some Castlevania fans would say the Nintendo 64 outings were faithful to the franchise, and that Lament and Curse offered more combat variety than any handheld could store. Others would begrudge the series for copying other popular 3D games instead of devil forging its own unique experience, especially given how unique the franchise was on the NES. If they got one thing right, it was that Castlevania can sometimes be unforgiving. Only the patient persevere. Part 4 of the Castlevania Retrospective, slayers can fit the whole of the castle in the palm of their hand. Nintendo, Castlevania, and a charged-up battery have shared a special relationship. Small sequels light up in black and white, advanced adventures introduce new faces, and a sorrowful sorcerer leads the transition to dual-screen slaying.